lot of people claim to practice holistic health or even holistic medicine, but underneath the surface, it's really just the same approach doctored up and presented through a slightly different lens. But every once in a while, I come across someone who's on the front lines and actually working with a number of the world's high performers in different capacities. Sometimes these folks propping up the high performers are in the shadows and not as well known. Perhaps they don't have massive social media presence, they don't have a huge online platform, but nonetheless, they have lots of real world experience that we all can learn from. And that's exactly what I'm bringing to you this week. In this conversation, we discuss the importance of beginning any protocol only after establishing an understanding of physical health, both the quantitative side and the qualitative. We go behind the scenes to discuss some of the technologies our guest uses to actually get that snapshot of his client's current state. One of those is a diagnostic I've discussed a number of times in this podcast called heart rate variability, HRV, but not the way most of us are used to seeing it. The form of HRV he uses is much more advanced and yields more actionable results. We discuss the power of live blood analysis to measure the faster responses to state changes. We also discuss assessments and the whole qualitative side neglected in traditional healthcare. Then we go on to the other non physical realms, such as the mind, emotions, and we discuss at length a system called the Hermetic Principles, as outlined in a book called the Kybalion. Although we had no intention of diving into these, and I didn't even know he was familiar with that work, to me, it's a system that warrants discussion because it really helps elucidate and clarify a lot of the natural phenomenon we experience in life and we see around us. So, if you feel inspired, I suggest picking up that book and giving it a flip through. Later in the conversation, we discuss the topic of toxicities and homotoxicology and German biological medicine, as well as how your adaptability determines so much of your overall health. Our guest shares his opinion and approach to longevity, how to optimize it the right way, and in general, when it comes to health, the missing layer of context, the role that plays, and how to look at things and make better choices. Our guest this week is Roland Pankewich. He's a health explorer dedicated to understanding all aspects of wellness. His journey began with physical health and expanded into nutrition, biochemistry, functional medicine, biophysics, bioenergetics, metaphysics, shamanism, psychedelics, and Eastern practices. And in this interview, we touch on each of those. Roland runs Peak Performance Bioenergetics, a consulting firm for high performance clients, and he teaches health professionals how to adopt a truly holistic perspective. Mentored by a number of the world's leading experts, Roland applies his unique approach to not only consulting, but also teaching. You can find the show notes for this one and all the resources we discuss at mindbodypeak.com/163. And if he provides them, I will be sure to go back and update the show notes with a link to his socials and or website. Okay. Well, sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with my friend, Roland Pankewich. Roland, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Yeah, we've been coordinating this one for months now, and I'm excited to dive into a number of different topics with you. But first, one thing that stood out from our conversation a second ago is that you are in the health and wellness world, and you're successful despite not having a website or any presence on social media. So what is it that you do that you're able to have success despite those limitations or perceived limitations?
I mean, if any business coach saw how I operated, they'd be like, "You're hell bent on failure, aren't you?" But I believe that perception is reality and belief powers up perception. So I'll explain what I mean. Years ago, I was in nutrition school and I started to realize that everyone spends so much time, and there's no fault in this. It's just an opportunity to build out your brand. And there's so many people who have these like turnkey things that are like, oh, I'll teach you how to brand. And then everyone follows the pattern. And there was this moment where I had this aha. If I try to look at everything 180 degrees from how everyone else looks at it to see if there's something that's not being seen. And I had this internal thought of going, everyone's going to do their same version of the same framework. The same scaffolding is going to be there for everyone. So what's the differentiating factor in what determines success for one and maybe a lack of success for the other? It's about who likes who better. It's about, the one thing that someone can judge in an instant versus the thing that someone's going to get turned off by. So I went, well, everyone's spending so much time branding. Why don't I just learn the stuff that no one else wants to learn? And how that led me into where I am now is it kind of gave me this opportunity to get into these different echelons of professionalism and being exposed to different people. Because of what I knew, I would interact with someone who would say, oh, you have to meet my friend. You guys have mutual interests. And so that was, like one of the top bodybuilders in the world introduced me to a guy who's Sidney Crosby's personal trainer, who introduced me to a whole bunch of people in the NHL. And then it just kind of evolved to where I get these random phone calls or text messages every so often that so-and-so wants to reach out. They want this done. They want that done. And I've just never believed that this way of doing business was going to lead to failure. So I'll call it like a happy Forrest Gump accident, but it's allowed me to focus on my craft so I can really sharpen my skill set. And I believe there's a big guidance aspect. I've made it ready for those who are willing to come to see me because they're also ready for what it is I do, because it's not as common as other people in the health space.
Well, Roland, we will break down what it is that you do and why these like elite athletes and like high level business people seek you out. But before we get into that, let's warm up with the unusual non-negotiables you've done so far today for your health, your performance, and your bioharmony.
Well, it's funny you say bioharmony because I literally got something delivered to me yesterday called, it's from a company called Biogeometry. I don't know if you've ever heard of them.
Oh, yeah, I have their cube right
There you
here,
go.
and I have
Oh my God, this is weird. This is awkward. Got this.
Look at that.
I told you, not only was the weird t-shirt color a synchronicity, but what are the odds of those things happening? There's something going on in the world right now. So to answer your question, I've wanted to anchor the grid of where I work because you can't escape 5G. I live in not a condensed city center, but I live downtown, St. Petersburg. And there's a lot of non-native electromagnetic fields and various things that cause a lack of resonance to our own biofield. So one thing that I've done today that I've been wanting to do for a while is I'm trying to anchor the spaces that I spend most of my time in to be as resonant and energetically hospitable as possible. But, the other thing that I try to do is I try to have consistency within my day. So it's a very simple thing, but the simple things really move the needle. I get up in the morning and I go outside and I put my feet on the ground and I get some sun in my eyes. Why? I want to set my circadian rhythm and I want to touch into the ground, having been disconnected from the earth for 8 hours overnight. I hydrate first thing in the morning. I put some trace minerals in water or some Celtic sea salt. Why? Because water and structured water in the body and making sure you have minerals helps all of those cellular processes be optimized from a raw material supply perspective. Some people are intermittent fasters. I've kind of changed my tune on that. So I follow kind of like a natural biorhythm of when I eat breakfast, similar time every day. And I have coffee with my wife first thing in the morning because that's how I start my day before I do anything else. So at least I can have a little bit of quiet time before the rush of the day gets going.
I didn't realize it, but our morning routines are almost identical too, including the salt and the trace minerals in the water.
This is getting weirder and weirder. Wait till I start finishing your sentences halfway through the podcast.
Yes, exactly. All right, let's go back to where we left off. And what is it that you do that is bringing these people into your sphere?
I'll start with kind of telling the story of what I've done that's brought me to this realization of what I do now. I've always been fascinated with health and performance specifically. You know, I remember being a young kid and watching like the world's strongest man competitions or watching Olympic athletes and going, wow, that is like the pinnacle of what a human is capable of doing. The how of that fascinates me, not the why, the how. How does it all come together? And I was always interested in non-typical sports, very much individual sports when I was younger. I started studying exercise to become more powerful and stronger for the sports that I'd play, and I eventually settled on kickboxing, which is not a great career path. So if anyone wants to become a professional fighter, might not want to use your head as a punching bag for the long term. That being said, exercise showed me that there's this physical coherence in the body that athletes have. And there is an intelligence to an athlete's body that is not IQ, but we'll call it PQ, a physical quotient. I don't know if that's a thing, but I just made it up. And as you start to do these things, you start to attune your nervous system to have a greater level of capability and adaptability. And that is really what, other than the God-given talent, which separates a good athlete from a great athlete, is how attuned they are to their body. As I got through that, I started doing personal training and various other things. And then the world pushed me in a different direction. And I started studying nutrition and biochemistry. And it was a holistic school. And I was so closed off to anything holistic, hippie, granola. I remember I was in a course and someone volunteered me to do muscle testing. And I'm like, listen, lady, I've studied exercise mechanics. I can beat your test. I was so arrogant in my thinking. And she muscle tested something and I tried to cheat it every which way, but no matter what I did, I failed the test. I'm like, oh, there's something to this. But I myself was never considered a good student. So as I was going through school, the owner of the school came up to me one day. She said, Roland, I know the courses you're going to teach for me when you graduate. And I was just left stunned. I'm like, I haven't even handed in half of my homework. You want me to teach for you? And the opportunity came and I had no tutelage and no preparation really for teaching. I had to figure it all out. So I just started focusing on understanding biochemical pathways and organ systems and all these things. And then teaching helped me communicate what I had to learn practically in order to help people. So it went from this exercise thing to exercise and movement plus food, and then the body and biochemistry. Fast forward after a few years, I'm like, I really wish there was something more to this. I wish I could test people like a doctor, but not prescribe pharmaceutical. And then literally the world of functional medicine was introduced to me a month later, very much, serendipitous. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever because you're testing biomarkers and you're looking at functional capacities of things. And then you start drilling down into functional medicine. This is not a criticism of functional medicine, but it's still a bit of a halfway house because the limitations of functional labs are that you will never figure out a health-based process by focusing on disease. So that's a philosophical thing that I believe and I've learned. And then the second thing is a human being technically is a different person every second of the day. So if someone does a functional lab test and it takes 4 weeks for the results to come back, who are you really treating? It's not to say there's no value in it, but then you start to get introduced to the hierarchy of sciences, and the biochemistry world is what predominates in the Western world. But then I started going deeper when I started studying things like Eastern traditions, Chinese medicine, some of the metaphysical stuff, the chakra systems. And then I don't know if you've ever delved into this, but the world of biophysics. So it's where the laws of nature interact with the physical universe. In the context of health, it's looking at humans as energetic beings primarily that take on physical form. And you start to realize how these very complex interactions, although simple in essence, it takes a lot to understand the context of biophysics. And that's still where I am in my own journey because I'm never a student of, standing still. I'm always going to be a student of life. So I think it's all of these things that have given me this wide cast net to be able to connect with a strength coach in pro hockey, or, an energetic coach who does shamanic work, or someone who's a functional medicine or an allopathic doctor. I try to speak everyone's language and figure out where the unification is. Because the physical person is physical, but they're also a mental, an emotional, and a spiritual being. And I've realized that holistic encompasses all of those things. And you're the first person I'm going to mention this to, but I've come up with this concept of not just a holistic health practitioner, but a hybrid health practitioner, meaning what the person requires is where you start with them. So I just had a client who was here. He was ex-military. So I'm not going to talk to him about the concept of childhood traumas and figuring out what's going on with chakras, I'm going to get into like, he's got tightness, he's got some stuff going on with the body. We look at a movement thing, and then we talk about lifestyle, food, diet, supplementation, exercise. But then I bring him into the world of bioresonance and bioenergetics with diagnostic tools I have. I look at the autonomic nervous system, and from knowing how the body organizes itself in terms of how it regulates itself and the interconnections of all the organs and tissues, you can make assessments and I don't want to say assumptions because they're not assumptions, they're pattern recognitions of where someone's body is based upon looking at the nervous system. And that allows me to figure out who I'm working with and where I'm going to go. So it probably answered a little bit more than your question. I'm sorry for oversharing the context of info there, but I think that answered it fundamentally.
With that approach, if he's coming to you and he mentions that he has this tightness and you look at it and see it as an overflowing stress bucket or high allostatic load, and you don't think that he's necessarily going to be receptive to the idea of like one of these holistic practices, what do you do in that situation? Because I'm sure all the time people come to you wanting and thinking it's one thing when you say, okay, well, like that's like the symptom. But if I go below that and we address the layer below that, then it will fix the upstream issue as well.
Well, I think the answer to that in concept is exactly what you put forth. What is the best way to stimulate an adaptation from an allostatic load perspective? You introduce the least amount of unaccustomed activity to allow for the appropriate response and regulation, i.e. an adaptation. So with a guy like that, if he's coming to me to experience something body related, the first thing I do is I have a very long conversation and I ask him to tell me his story. Because success for someone's life leaves clues as to where major milestones of things happen. So if he starts to talk about his body experience and he says, well, you know, I noticed this after this happened, or at this point in my life, this thing was a resonant theme, then I start to talk to him about, well, you know, what kind of experiences were you having and what kind of emotions were you having during that time frame? Was it highly stressful? And I go into the realm of how neurology works, where neurons that fire together begin to wire together. Simple concepts to explain to people, because if you have a physical trauma, any negative physical trauma usually has a negative emotion associated with it, which then has a memory that's attached to a mindset or a subconscious way of relating with that experience. And that's how I introduce it to a guy like that, because I meet him where he is, and I'll speak to him in his parlance as a military guy who's used to structure, hierarchy, and connection points. So I figure out how the person needs to be communicated with, and I bring him along the journey, and then I just listen.
Yeah. So a lot of it is just dressing up the way you're communicating the principles. You're not going to talk about chakras and energy management to him necessarily, but you can talk about like feelings of like anger or whatever it is, grief, being stuck in certain places of his body and that kind of thing, like how it impacts his neurology and physiology.
Exactly. But I also use technology to my advantage because I have a lot of devices I use for an assessment on everyone I see. It's very comprehensive. It takes about 2 hours. And the wonderful part is in the technology, they have the depiction of results across different spectrums of established medical practice based upon Western and Eastern medicine. So I can show someone their autonomic state of regulation, you know, what degree of sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system dominant they currently have, but it also shows it in a chakra page. So I can start to correlate. So if I want to introduce someone who's very left brain, Western minded to chakras, I look at where the correlation is. So what's at the center of every chakra? It's a major organ, right? So the root chakra, if you will, is the lower digestive system. Some people say it's the reproductive gland. Some people say that's second chakra. But I say, look, each major chakra has a center point of an organ. And the purpose of that organ is to communicate with the rest of the organs in the organ system via either typically a hormone or a neurotransmitter or something. And then we have the fast system, which is the nervous system, which is communicating systemically all the time, relaying info back to the brain. And then we have the slower system, which is the endocrine system. So I say chakras are an Eastern concept, a representation of the non-physical form of what our physical bodies are. And that usually softens people to go, oh, this isn't crazy pseudoscience that my yoga teacher was trying to talk to me about. It's actually something that can be established as an Eastern and Western way of describing the same thing.
Yeah. Joe Dispenza, he calls them energy centers to avoid the negative stigma that Westerners have with the idea of chakras.
And the reality is, if I can open someone up to a closure of perspective there, not only has their opportunity for change dramatically increased, but what they can actually allow into their lives, because again, perception is reality. If you think it's bogus, then it's going to be bogus to a large degree in your world. If you soften yourself to it, you become more open. And when people become more open, they move away from fear and they become able to heal, I think, a lot better.
All right. So you clearly start on the physical plane with a lot of people. If someone's recounting their story to you and they're leaving out something, perhaps it's because it was such a negative memory that they've dissociated from it and they can no longer recall it unless they're prompted. How do you know that they're giving you all the most important things?
The story someone tells is who that person is showing up as that day. So the most important thing is to honor what they're ready to willingly share, because you made a brilliant point. If the subconscious has stashed something away, I believe that that is a defense mechanism or a compensation mechanism that the human mind has for something that is too painful to consciously deal with. So if someone is willing to share with you the most valuable thing in their world, which is their inner secrets, you have to not go, oh, this is not the death, I'm going to go pull it out of you. Like, that is horribly arrogant and very, very, that's an energetic mismanagement of the Hippocratic Oath. To your point of how do I know that it's not the deepest thing? It doesn't really matter, because they start with what they want to start with. If you're working with someone, it's so easy to become romanticized about the idea of wanting what you want for them, and forgetting that they're going to tell you everything they want for themselves. And you have to, honor that. So yes, starting with the physical and then allowing someone to tell the story, I found that they always open themselves up naturally when the time is right.
You also alluded a minute ago to a 2-hour assessment intake. What are some of the tools that you use to help get that diagnostic baseline of where people are?
So I have 3 assessment devices. One is called the neural check. Have you ever heard of that before?
Yeah. Is that by BrainTap?
Yeah. So I do some work with BrainTap, and I help people I educate for them in terms of interpretation of the neural check. So that's my wide cast net. So the neural check it's like a blunt tool. It's not super strategic with anything, but it
Will you
gives me
explain what it is?
Yeah, I can actually show you. So it is simply a wrist clip device where you clip these 2 things on someone's wrist, you attach it to your computer, and the computer program runs a 300 heart rate analysis. And based upon the patterns of how the heart rhythm is being maintained, it can determine how someone's nervous system is choosing to coordinate and regulate itself. Now, people will call that HRV, and all of my real mentors in HRV turn their nose up at the term, because HRV isn't an actual thing. It's a marketing term. And most HRV devices like the Whoop, the Oura Ring, they're not real HRV. They're pulse analysis, be it digital pulse analysis through the finger, or they'll put some light transcutaneously through the wrist and they'll pick up a pulse analysis through the wrist. What they have to do is they have to run that through an algorithm that's proprietary, which is why your Whoop data and your Oura Ring data or your Apple Watch data are all going to be slightly different. So to me, the neural check is the best version of that broad spectrum analysis, and it gives me a baseline regulation pattern. Then I do a very specific autonomic nervous system assessment with a tool called the Nerve Express. So you put a Polar H10 heart rate monitor on, and I have a series of things that people do through a program that stress and challenge the nervous system to see how the nervous system and how the heart regulate in response to the test. And
are those tests like movements, or are they like exposures to other kinds of stimuli?
They're movements. So you start lying down, then you do an ortho test where you stand up, then you have a seat, you do a Valsalva test, which is a breath hold with some pressure that you generate in the abdominal region to create a stress. And then you compare and contrast that with deep breathing. And what I like about Nerve Express is it plots someone on a 4-quadrant assessment of where their sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are in terms of the responses to the test. And then the last thing I do is use a device called the Menla scan. It's a bioimpedance hand and foot and head assessment device where it puts a small amount of direct current on one side, a little bit of alternating current on the other side, and it models all the living tissues. So there's an incredible amount of information that's very overwhelming for people in there, but I'm looking for the most important measure of that test, which is called phase angle. Have you heard of phase angle before?
Yes.
So phase angle is a measure of living tissue vitality. And it also does like cellular water balance, intracellular, extracellular. And the reason those things matter is the vitality of living tissue, the amount of light it's able to express and exude, and the structure of the water in the cells and in the body is ultimately what determines if someone's healthy or not. So the autonomic nervous system lets me know how their system's regulating from an anabolic and a catabolic balance. Are they building resources? Are they regenerating healthy tissue? Are they conserving their energy, or are they doing the opposite? Are they driving with their car foot to the floor in the gas pedal the whole time? The second level of assessment is their tissue healthy, and do they have adaptability and reserve capacity left? Because I don't really care, and I say this not being not caring. What someone's diagnosis is just what someone told them they have. I'm interested in how your system's regulating because I don't work off of any specific diagnosis. I try to make your healthy tissue healthier. And if the thing you're dealing with resolves itself, then I'm happy. And because of my assessment, every intervention I do, I reassess someone the first day. Because if I'm not checking my work, I'm making assumptions. If I'm making assumptions, I have no idea if their body is tolerant to my interventions and they're getting better, or if it's actually too much for them and it's pushing them the opposite way. So that's my assessment process. Sit down, long conversation, because people need to be seen and heard. And then I'm assessing their state of regulation with no consideration of their diagnoses. I just want to know what their optimal energy process is and what their reserve capacity or adaptability is.
I think the qualitative of sitting down and listening to their story is something that's severely missing in the medical paradigm, and things will come through, information you won't get even just by looking at best, most high-tech like markers. You won't see it quantitatively necessarily.
Absolutely. Like you can look at someone's blood panel, but let's say you never look in their eyes and you see that state of like exhaustion in their face. That matters. You know, the average person is in and out of a physician's office in under 15 minutes. One of my clients came in the other day, said his buddy who has AFib, his doctor didn't even take a stethoscope to his chest and listen to his heart. And this guy's a cardiologist. I don't know who this doctor is, so, it's irrelevant. But what I'm getting at is your point is so important because the average person, and I've seen this, I've seen a heart rate variability assessment dramatically improve after someone had a huge emotional relief crying. Because thoughts and emotions are things. You can't see them, but you can feel them and experience them. And that's hearkening back to the holistic concept of the person, because someone can be physically stressed out as a result of a psycho-emotional problem that's driving the dysregulation, and the body's just showing that it's had enough.
Back to the original point about the lab work taking 4 weeks to get your results back, and then by then it might be out of date anyway and not useless, but have a lot less value. When you're doing these assessments, how rapidly do they change in response to like lifestyle? For example, if I was coming over to do an intake with you and I got stuck in traffic, I was going to be late. All of a sudden, obviously my stress hormones are going to shoot through the roof and my body is going to become much more dysregulated. So if we go into the intake then, I might have a terrible HRV. I might have like low phase angle, all like the symptom, like the signs of like someone who's very unhealthy. But then if you checked the next day or a couple hours later, perhaps it would be very different.
So some of those things would be, for example, you could have a massive stress response that would influence your HRV. But if someone's pattern regulation is their day-to-day life, other than the episode, is fairly stable, it might be a slight exaggeration of what their normal pattern would be. Phase angle is not going to change dramatically unless someone has been injured, unless they're severely dehydrated. So some of these markers are more long-term assessment, because you could have someone who has severe cancer and their phase angle is 4. It's not going to go to 7 overnight. it may bump up to 5.5 when they leave your office because you've done a variety of different energetic interventions that help to build, structured water and energy in the system. But there's only so much you can change some of those things on a short-term basis. The reason I love looking at the autonomic nervous system is the person can tell you something, but the physiology never lies. People can sit down and go like, yeah, I'm fine, but they don't realize they're fine. It's chaos. It's normal to them, but it's not necessarily a healthy state of regulation because they have no contrast. And that's where the average person is, because 5% of our realities, maybe more for some people, maybe less for others, is conscious. So if they are in a very much a rhythmic lull of their day-to-day being subconsciously guided, that's highly stress-driven, they don't think there's anything wrong, but that could be, massively adrenalized, regular cortisol output, hypodigestive function, necessitating blood sugar swings. That they're normal. So it's being able to go, well, you say this, you've had this day, but what I'm seeing here from your physiology is no matter what I do, the program, if you will, is being conserved. It means your body's in fight or flight, and fight or flight is the precipitating pathway to degeneration and illness.
And a lot of times that illness and degeneration will present differently. It might be the same exact thing, say low HRV, high stress hormones, whatever it is, but based on your genetics, your epigenetics, your lifestyle, your day, all kinds of different things, it might present itself differently. As the ancient medicines called it, your constitution. It's like based on that, it'll show up here as this symptom when it shows up for someone else as Y symptom.
That's such a brilliant assessment. And it's something that I've always thought of, and I'm starting to say this as a concept now. Health is simple, disease is complex. And when I say simple and easy are not synonyms. To be healthy is not an easy, intuitive thing, but it is a simple concept. For me, it's energy, adaptability equals optimal function. The more you have of each, and if you do the things on a regular basis that refill your cup, so to speak, and you're not doing things that drain you, you're likely to be healthy. But how is it that you take 5 people who have stressful lives, one gets cancer, one gets cardiovascular disease, one gets autoimmunity, one gets a mental health issue, and one just gets burnt out? Disease is so complex because there's so many different permutations of how it can manifest. And then to figure it out, you have to be a really good problem solver to reverse engineer all the things that person needs for their system to be able to rebalance itself, get out of sympathetics, get back into rest, recover, digest, and go from a catabolic to an anabolic state so they can reverse their symptom.
I like to look at it as just building health instead of targeting a disease, because if you target a disease by the nature of what you're doing, you're not actually going to address what's causing a disease. So if you focus on building health, it's the old adage of a rising tide lifts all boats. You're going to ideally address that issue and potential others that you might not even be aware of.
Have you ever thought of us being in an industry that we call the health industry, that we don't have a unified definition of the word health?
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because what are we all working towards?
And it's not just the absence of disease.
No, that just means you're not sick. That doesn't mean you're healthy. It means you could be in process. It's like that old internet dinner, that dial-up, like loading. Wait for that loading bar to finish, then the symptom pops up.
One thing you mentioned a second ago is that someone might come in and their physiology never lies. They might say that they're fine, they're doing great. And then you do your quantification assessments and you see a lot of dysregulation. How much of a difference does their mindset and perspective of the stress make? So if I go in and I think that I'm doing great and I'm dysregulated, I'll still probably be in a better state than if I went to you ran the test, and I was stressed about being stressed.
I've seen certain pattern regulations, and it's a very interesting question, only because if someone is under chronic stress, but their mental fortitude and their ability to manage it as a concept is quite strong, then their initial baseline assessment actually shows up much better than you would think otherwise. But I figured out a little tool and a little trick that I do to figure out what someone's real pattern display might be. So I call it the hamster wheel. As long as you're on the wheel has a certain amount of inertia it generates, right? So the hardest part about getting a wheel started is the beginning. Once it's rolling, you can be more efficient with your energy. That metaphor is like stress. If you keep the stress going, you can run with that stress as long as you want, but you are at the mercy of its existence to keep things in balance. When I see someone like that, they're, we'll call them a physical mess, but they're a mental point of stability. When I try to chill them out, meaning I put them in a really relaxed state, then their first initial baseline gets a lot worse after I test them. Why? Because I made them relax. And when the body relaxes, it shows itself. The reason why most heart attacks happen on a Monday, because you chill out on a Sunday. So I thought about that a while back, and it used to freak me out going, oh my God, I'm going to kill this person. Like, they were so good and now they're over here. I'm like, that's because you made them try to access the other half of the teeter-totter, but they don't have it. So it exhausts them to relax, and they feel worse because they can finally allow their body to go, the out-breath happened.
Because you're no longer running on cortisol and norepinephrine and adrenaline and all the other hormones that keep you going forward. And when you're used to those, I guess you have like a bit of a withdrawal if you don't experience it, even if it's as simple as from just being stressed. Because you also look at high performers, and a lot of them like credit their stress as their advantage, and like it's what kept them going forward. It's what propelled them forward. So I can imagine that having that conversation about, hey, like perhaps you should add some stress management practices into your routine would be a hard conversation to have.
Well, you're basically telling someone the way that they're living their life isn't conducive to their wellness, but that reality may not jive with how they want to live. So it's really a question of, what do you want to do about this? Because the faster you get off the hamster wheel and you learn that you can rest before you jump back on the wheel, there's nothing wrong with stress and stress as a stimuli to promote high performance and excellence. I think it's a wonderful thing, or else we would all be mediocre at best. That being said, it's the relationship with that. And I think the understanding the interplay between the mental projection of hard work and dedication and what the body has to do to provide you the opportunity to do and support that is misunderstood. That's where these things become problematic, because I think as we get from 0 to 25 years old, we're in such an anabolic phase. It doesn't really matter how much you stress yourself to some degree, because you have enough reserve in the bank. You have enough money in the bank to keep swiping or tapping the card, and it's not really consequential to your long-term saving. It's once you cross over that threshold and you start to see the small signs of that vitality, that invincibility start to go away, like, aches and pain, tightness. It's, I can't eat what I used to. The little things that your body starts telling you, but you don't actually associate them with, I'm actually losing adaptability. So I'm compromising my system. And I like using a car analogy. Like, does driving your car harder make your car age more optimally? Like, does jamming on the brakes, does flooring the car, does flat foot shifting, does it make your car work better, or does it cause a breakdown, premature breakdown? That is the thing that we don't understand with our own bodies, because they are biological technology, but there are rules to how the physiology has to regulate and govern itself if we want this thing to be able to perform into our 5th, 6th, and 7th decade of life, let alone not even perform, not be diseased at that point. Health isn't guaranteed. Death is, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. But health is not guaranteed unless you understand how to take the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual aspects of self and find harmony so all of them can achieve some sort of subjective balance. Because what balance might mean to you might be totally different for me. As you said, our constitutions may be different, although I think you and I are pretty similar because of our shirt color and our biogeometry ring wearing, but other people might have a different reality in that way. So that's how I would look at that.
Yeah. And so if you're increasing your stress load from lifestyle, from different things, because like the overall stress load, it's not just unique to work stress, and your body silos off relationship stress and financial stress and all these as different places. It all builds one stress bucket. It all contributes to that one. So if you're under greater stress and it's necessary for a chapter of your life to get through something. From your own analogy a minute ago, it seems to me like what would become important then is not necessarily to avoid that, because sometimes it's inevitable, but instead to focus on building the other side of the seesaw and focusing on more recovery, more parasympathetic activities, and giving your body that break from all the stress.
Perfectly said. It's funny because when I was younger, when I would train in the gym, I would only plan my workouts, right? I would only prioritize the stress side of things. Now I prioritize and plan my recovery, or I give it equal weight to my exercise in the context of what I want to achieve. But you start to realize that perspective grows with age and wisdom. So to your point, there may be times where the stress of someone's experience is a non-negotiable. It's what they've selected. And the term I came up with is, how do you optimize the compromise? Everything in someone's world is a compromise because of how society has structured itself to force us to structure ourselves within society. So I'm not here to tell someone never to have stress. I'm not going to try to turn you into a jellyfish or like a deer just chewing leaves, staring off into nothingness. Everyone doesn't need to become an Eckhart Tolle, I'm just living, not having any desires beyond what my existence brings in. It's more so, how do we manage life as it is, and how do we find the optimal balance point to where your current reality, which is all that exists, has a nice duality between the yin and the yang of stress and recovery. But how do we also go back and deal with everything that you've told yourself that has ever happened to you in the form of a story that has a negative impact on creating the stress response? How do we change the past so you don't automatically find yourself there in the future? Because as we age, the ability to tolerate those patterns shrinks more and more and more. And I think when someone develops a physical ailment, it's already a psychological, an emotional, and a spiritual ailment. The body is just the last place it shows up. So it's been there for a while. We just finally experience it when we can compensate no more.
Gotcha. Well, so how do you work on those other levels then? We talked about the physical a little bit, about the physical diagnostics and assessments, then to work on or get a glimpse into the mental, the emotional, the spiritual. How do you do that?
Well, that's, again, very much a personal process, but from a fundamental framework, you take the ability for the person to tell their story as a way to introduce them to the idea of holding space and feeling safety. What I mean by safety is like not a lack of fear of someone bursting into the door with a gun. It's the scariest thing for many humans is to be open and vulnerable because you're defenseless there, right? We have these masks and these armors and shields that we put up, and we project out who we want the world to see us as, but people who are quite in tune can see who's really in there, who's not wanting to come out. And I think a big part of everyone's healing is simply learning to love themselves. And it starts by just being able to hold space so someone can express. And from the ability to express, they realize, oh, that feels quite good. Maybe I will start to admit the things that I'm most vulnerable about. And then when they go through that process of vulnerability, realizing there's no judgment, there's no expectations, because things just are. People walk around holding all of these regrets or these scenarios of negative relationship with things that have happened, but they're all just concepts. None of it's actually real anymore, because if it's not in their here and now, I try to communicate this concept to people so they don't fear the things that they're holding that only they can let go. So that's the next level down, starting to look at how the psycho and the emotional things are intertwined. And I relate that to what's going on in their body, because if you look at Ayurveda, which you were talking about India just before this, or you look at traditional Chinese medicine, there is no separation between the physical and the non-physical. So if someone's highly fearful, well, that's a root chakra problem in one, concept. That's a kidney chi problem in another. If someone's very grief-filled, that's a heart chakra problem, or that's, a stomach, spleen, worry scenario. So it's almost like if you start to show them how all of these things interconnect, you can go, I can give you every supplement for your liver possible, but unless you deal with the anger that's inside of your system. And, funny, I was meditating yesterday, the concept of releasing things. And I had this thing say to me, the only way to release is to let go. And I started giggling. I'm like, how friggin' simple is that? It's teaching people that they can be accepted by another, showing the most vulnerable aspects of self. And once we've identified the pattern that created this, how can we rewire it in real time with their leading the way? Meaning, how do you want to live? I can't tell someone how to relate to things. I can't tell them how they should relate to something or what they want to relate to. I say, what do you want to do? Because from a place of being able to be open, to be vulnerable, and to love yourself, the next thing is to be able to take control of your life and live life on the terms that you're willing to and wishing to live by. So that's when it gets down to the non-physical aspect. And if someone really needs to, I spent many years doing psychedelic shamanism and guidance for people. If that's something where they feel like there's a big block and they're brave enough and they want it, not anyone forcing it upon them, that might be a path to where someone has, a major milestone in their life break. And then I think after that, people need to take some time to reintegrate, because just like you mentioning how do you balance out that work recovery thing, in a health context or a personal wellness development context, there's times to work and then there's times to just be. Because the whole goal is to be able to live in a state of optimal joy and satisfaction with who you are and what you're doing as often as possible, knowing you can't control every variable outside of yourself, things that will come up as challenges. But if you can wake up every morning being happy to be alive and being grateful and joyful, and you can go to bed every day going, I had a really great day. I'm so happy that I got to do this and I can get to do it again tomorrow. I think that's a pretty awesome place to be.
Yeah. And so much of what we're talking about relates back to the idea of yin and yang, work and then just being, stress and then relaxation. Like it's all on the duality of one extreme, or maybe not even too much of an extreme, and then the opposite pole.
Yeah, it's the concept of polarity. Have you ever read the book, The Kybalion?
Yes, great book.
So that's one of my absolute must reads for anyone who wants to dive into this, because it's like the nine principles of how to live life in this third dimensional reality. And I love the law of polarity because it asks the question, where does hot end and cold begin? It's one continuum of the opposite thing. And that's really what I think one of the most powerful abilities to learn in life is how to balance that. So like if you want to go super hard in life, i.e. you want to train hard, compete in some sport, be an entrepreneur, a high achiever, then yes, you will need to push hard. But if you want long-term balance, you also need to learn how to be off just as equally. And relaxing with intensity is kind of like an oxymoron, but it's like when you're off, you're off. And it's that pull back and the personality addiction to the things that I think people have the hardest time navigating. But you're absolutely right. The simple principle of the yin and the yang say everything that we need to know without saying anything of detail in this world.
Off the top of your head, do you remember the other principles that they went through in the Kybalion?
Let's test me right now. So the first one is mentalism. The universe is a thought in the mind of God. So if you take that to, and I think it's the most powerful one, everything in your world is experienced inside of you. Like you are my external projection through my brain, through my eyes to see, but you are still my creation, so to speak. So I think the mentalism aspect is super important to understand that everything you think both consciously and subconsciously creates your reality. And it's a fractal pattern of whatever created this. So you have mentalism, you have polarity, you have cause and effect, you have gender, you have rhythm.
And to go on to cause and effect, that one I found interesting because it says that there's a cause and effect behind everything. And it might seem like things just randomly happen in our lives, in the world and everything. But if you actually understood all the factors, it would be like a very obvious, this combination of factors coalesced into this outcome over here. It isn't actually random.
Well, I love that the whole concept says chance is a name for a law not yet understood, right? So every cause has its effect, every effect has its cause. And the interconnected web of reality always has a reason as to why things happen. But I think our human brains lack the ability to rise high enough to see things outside our human-centric perspective because our own bias and ego creates symbolism with how we assess things. So I think cause and effect are super powerful, because if you are guided by your urges and impulses, then the effect of everything that's happened to you in your life is caused by something like that. For example, your lack of awareness, your lack of personal vigilance. At the same time, your extreme neuroses can be the cause of your hypervigilance and your absolute adherence to never being suboptimal. So either way, you're playing on the opposite end of extremism with those examples, but the rule stays the same.
It's really helpful. It's a good read. I need to go back now. I want to go back and pick it up and give it another one. 'Cause when I read it, I looked around at life and just understood so many of the things and how they worked and why they worked particular ways. It felt like it was like a big burden lifted off my chest.
Well, we just missed one. We missed vibration, which is almost the most important thing, because everything in the universe vibrates. Nothing is ever at rest. And on the low end, the lowest vibration is moving the slowest. So it's so solid. On the high end, things move so fast that they can't have any physical mass at all. But eventually they move so quickly that they appear to be standing still.
Yeah. What's also very cool about these is that a lot of like the modern spirituality is built on these concepts and principles. But I believe the origin of these laws dates back a very long time ago.
Oh, well, Hermes Trismegistus, who's like, people think he's Thoth. He's various other iterations of demigod who walked the planet. This is before the times of the Egyptians. If you believe in Lemuria and Atlantis, it's supposedly old world wisdom that survived the test of time, that is a gift for us in modern humanity to try to figure out what it is we are and who we are. So no one actually knows how old these things are. No one can even say who the author, the three initiates, we don't know who the authors actually were, but this book has been around forever. And I think at the turn of the 1900s, it resurfaced shortly thereafter. And I believe those things, again, cause and effect. If society is going through a rapid awakening, there are things that are the impetus or the stimulus of that. And I think everyone listening would benefit from reading the Kybalion probably 9 times, not once, not twice, because it's the kind of book that every time you read it, you get more out of it.
We had a discussion months ago about your stance on pro-metabolic health and energy and adaptability. Do you recall that?
I remember we spoke about a lot of things, but if you can remind me of the exact details of what we spoke about, I'd love to dig into that, because that's kind of my whole deal nowadays.
Yeah. Okay. So tell me about that. Tell me about your whole deal on pro-metabolic health and energy and adaptability.
Got it. So if we want to be healthy, we have to define what determines health if we're going to chase something, right? So if we're looking at physiology, the hierarchy of how we're organized is the smallest unit of biological or physiological existence in us is a single cell. So a cell gathered together in a creative way or a structured way becomes a tissue. A tissue gathered together in a structured way becomes an organ, which then becomes part of an organ system, which becomes part of an organism, which then becomes part of a community. So it's just this fractal pattern of like Russian doll. What does a cell need in order to be healthy every day? It needs oxygen, it needs water, it needs amino acids, fatty acids, glucose, sugars to some degree, and it needs cofactors, vitamins, minerals, antioxidants. So if that's really what a cell needs, all a cell is wanting to do is be able to perform its work as a cell and thus give birth to a daughter cell. And that's just the lineage. So when I started to look at that, it made me realize that health is really about energy. So if I want to have healthy metabolism, to me, energy isn't Red Bull or coffee or any kind. That's a stimulant. It gives you a heightened feeling of awareness through the release of stress hormones, through the adrenal system, the autonomic nervous system. But energy is different than stimulation. Energy is having the ability to do anything you want, be it physical, mental, regardless of your level of fatigue or lack of fatigue. So I started thinking about how can I communicate the concept of what every healthy person seems to have? And energy was my guiding thing. It's like, if I have energy, If I can repair myself faster than my injuries accumulate, I'm healthy. If I start to injure myself faster than my ability to repair, I become ill.
And to be clear, when you say injure yourself, you're not referring to physical injuries like a slipped disc or a hernia or a knee injury. You're talking about cellular injuries.
Correct. The physical injuries are preceded by a multitude of cellular injuries, typically inflammatory in nature, that are driven by a few things. One, excess toxicity of internal or external load. Number two, excess residency of pro-immune things like stimulants, be it bacterial, viral infections, again, the toxic load. Three, the inability to properly make energy in the presence of oxygen, so a lack of oxygen delivery because of some sort of circulatory issue. Four, the lack of ability for a cell to have enough energy to vacate itself of waste materials to the lymphatic system and the organs of detoxification. So anything that jams up that cell's ability to make energy creates a sick cell. If I have a sick cell, I have a cell that has a lack of adaptability. So ultimately, the only thing that cell can do to survive is divide prematurely, or else it initiates its own internal death. It's called apoptosis. We take that fractal pattern and make it more organismic. Its energy and adaptability equals optimal function. And I've subcategorized what I think the internal state of optimal function are contingent upon in the body. So the body has to have a sense of self-identity. This is like the ultimate lack of self-identity is a manifestation of cancer, I believe. A cell thinks it's no longer part of the ecosystem. The second thing is a sense of self-regulation. So if I have type 2 diabetes, I can't regulate energy metabolism in some way because I've broken or dysregulated some mechanism. Third thing is self-communication. Cells are always talking to themselves and talking to each other. There's a language of the body that is not English. So if that cell is unable to properly communicate with itself because its internal environment is compromised, or the other cells in a healthful manner, then any good relationship is broken down by communication. Self-compensation is another thing. So if you go back to a physical injury, is a sprained ankle that swells up a bad thing? No, if you want it to heal, but if you take a Tylenol and walk on it, yeah, that's probably a bad thing. So when we have the inability to compensate is when we have, I believe, arrived at the stage of complex disease diagnosis, because illness is a conscious decision by the body. And the last thing is self-regeneration. I long ago realized that as a health practitioner, I don't heal anybody. They heal themselves. Like the supplement you give someone doesn't provide the healing signal. The supplement gives the body something either that it's missing, or it helps the body remove something that it currently can't get out so it can go back to expressing health. And this is my model of health because at the end of the day, anything that compromises my adaptability takes away energy. Anything that takes away energy moved me away from optimal function. And on that spectrum, the further I move from optimal function, the closer I am to illness. And whatever the illness is, what it selects for is based upon the person. Your genetic phenotype, your environment, your lifestyle, your mental states, your biochemical status, vitamin and mineral status, how strong your organs function. But it's really, I think, all encompassed in that model, which I'm continuously evolving because I like figuring out where I'm wrong or will challenge me to make me think, I haven't thought about that yet.
So when you're actually applying that, say a client presents himself and they have an issue, how do you use that framework to guide what you will do with them?
That's a great question. The ultimate reality of how I do that is via the explanation of what I see regarding the introductory assessments that we talked about, right? So if someone has low level phase angle, if they have cellular dehydration, if they have a high sympathetic dominant, if they have all of the patterns that predispose them to disease. And I also have other technologies that I use. One is an old school electronic acupuncture device. Have you ever seen these before?
No.
So it's a practice of German biological medicine called homotoxicology that's been around for over 100 years. But through the knowledge of the meridians, each finger and each toe has a meridian that corresponds with an organ. And in biological medicine, there's a hierarchy of the least important organ in the system is the skin, and the most important, I shouldn't say organ, body system organ is the skin. The most important organ body system is the immune system. So if you can see the patterns of what's showing up either inflamed or suppressed, then you can figure out what remedies someone may need to help their body clear out whatever body system is gummed up, because the whole idea is you heal in the reverse order that you got sick. You start with the most shallow stuff, and then you start to purge the deep stuff, but that takes a while.
And that's called German biological medicine?
So it is called homotoxicology. Technically, it's a study of how humans get sick, but it's under the moniker of German biological medicine because they're looking at codifying the Chinese system by putting a small amount of electric current into the meridian and figuring out its degree of conductivity. And then based upon the degree of conductivity, you can figure out what remedy the body wants rather than go, oh, well, you need a parasite detox. Well, you can test all of those remedies against someone because the limitation of functional medicine is how do you know what their detoxification capacity is like? How is their lymph working? How is their liver working? What are their kidneys looking like? You can only go so deep based upon biochemical specimen analysis. So, some people would say this stuff is woo-woo. It's just putting a small amount of current through a meridian. And if you read a book called The Ground Matrix by Alfred, I'm going to butcher his last name, Pischinger, I believe, which is written probably before 1950, he actually studied that meridians on the skin have a different biochemical composition and thus electrical conductivity compared to the skin that is not at the terminal end of the meridian. So what you're doing is you're testing the ground matrix to see how much congestion is in the extracellular space into the intracellular space, and you're trying to push it out in the order of operations like bed mass, like solving an equation. That's one thing I will use if I look at someone's state of regulation and I go, man, you're not in a great state. How do we start to heal you? And I have other combinations of devices I use. And the other device I have, sorry to be really long-winded, is a piece of technology that uses extremely high frequencies to look at the regulation state of the entire human body.
What's the technology called?
The closest technology that it probably exists from Russia is called the Oberon system, but we call this it's just extremely high frequency, the quantum emitter, if you will. And what it does is it's able to ping a frequency into the body and bounce that frequency off of an organ, kind of like a submarine using sonar. And it is able to give you a state of regulation based upon how a healthy tissue should look from a vibrational perspective compared to how it does look in that human. And from there, you can figure out if someone has a functional disturbance, something that would show up on a blood panel or a urine test. What precedes the physical disturbance is an energetic disturbance, the vibratory disturbance. So if their regulation state in the subcellular space is less than optimal, you can find a way to drive the healing frequency back in. So you're reprogramming the body to get out of the healing crisis back into a healing state.
Is this like a bioresonance machine?
Something similar, far more complex in how it works and very, very accurate because you're able to look at the different regulation states in different parts of the organs and you can drill down deeper into the cells. I love technologies. And I have a live blood cell microscope that I haven't busted out in a while. I think that's another cool device to look at the before and after of working with someone. Because if you see an internal state change, and this is something we don't do as clinicians very often, I think, we don't see if from when the person showed up in the office to when they leave, do they actually look better? We do the things that we do with them. We give them the stuff. We expect them to take it when they get home. Why not test it before they leave to make sure with confidence that that person is actually responding well to said thing?
Will the blood reflect that quickly enough?
I believe so, just because the main purpose of the blood is to carry oxygen around the tissues, right? And if you look at how the cardiovascular system is constructed, it goes from big to small. And the small arterioles, the tiny little vessels, in some cases, are probably no bigger in diameter than a single red blood cell thick. So if your red blood cells are stacked on top of each other, and it's a phenomenon called rouleau, they look like a stack of coins. The blood isn't viscous. The blood's flowing more like syrup, less like water. So what happens there? The small arteries don't have proper passageway because the physical mass of what's trying to fit into them is too large. So if you don't deliver oxygen to a working cell, what happens to a cell when it doesn't have aerobic metabolism? What's plan B? Anaerobic metabolism. So anaerobic metabolism is fermentation, which is the byproduct of the buildup of acids. And it's a lack of energy because in aerobic energy production, 1 gram of carbohydrate yields 36 ATP, or one molecule. 1 molecule of glucose in an anaerobic state yield 2 to 4 ATP. So if my cells start to starve out, they bioaccumulate and they can't get things out of them. And that's, and this is not a one-day thing. We're talking months and years of this is really what I believe create the initiation and the development to chronic degenerative condition. So what live blood cell does is it shows you the state change of the blood after interventions, and you always want the red blood cells to be optimally formed. You want them to be adequately spaced. You don't want to see anything weird in the blood. So again, it's probably not universally accepted in the Western world, but as a 100-plus-year-old practiced in different parts of the world where maybe they don't treat everything with pharmaceuticals, that's good enough for me.
I've seen that technology used most often for evaluating non-native EMF measures, protection devices and systems and everything, and then also for grounding and earthing to show that it has an impact on the blood. But when I was looking into live blood analysis, it seems like the platform fee or whatever it is insanely expensive in the US at least.
In the sense of like utilizing it or getting involved as a practitioner?
Yeah, getting involved as a practitioner. Like that was one of the things that I read is preventing a larger scale rollout.
I think so. I mean, microscopes aren't cheap. A good microscope is probably $3,000 to $5,000. But once you have them, I think all you need is the slide, but you have to find a place to properly train. And there's a cool place like Quantum University has a course, but you can also meet people who do it. And I'm sure there may be someone who could do private coaching or something of that nature. But there's a large intimidation factor because like anything, there's knowing how to do it, then there's developing proficiency as a skilled practitioner. And the only way you can do that is by pricking tons of fingers.
Yeah, I think it was because like the technology was like there's like a royalty or patent or some kind of weird thing where someone told me that the startup cost was like 400 grand in the US.
I've never heard that. I mean, I bought a microscope and I had no specific massive, maybe I skirted around something, but I don't believe so because the live blood cell, and basically what it is, the microscope, it's got a high-powered slide or high-powered magnifying glass of different degrees of magnification, and you just take a finger prick of blood, put it between two glass slides, and slide it under the...
So you also mentioned last time we talked that you were up to some things on the longevity side.
Yeah, I'm always looking at what creates the optimal combinations of variables to longevity, because for me, longevity and lifespan is something different than health span. I don't want to be 100 with someone changing my diaper, living in a wheelchair. I'd rather get to 85. And you know what? I went rock climbing a week ago and my time to exit. I think the single most powerful tool when it comes to longevity is not anything that we've yet discussed, but it's exercise and movement. In addition to state of mind, because if you believe that, life is abundant and wonderful and various things, you will likely continue to live a life that attracts those things. But if we're talking about the physical aspects to what influences us, the one thing that seems to affect all things that we've talked about positively is exercise and movement, because moving your muscles and moving energy through the system is always going to help to fortify things like metabolic function, mitochondrial function, blood flow, removal of toxic waste materials, things of that nature. So then we go into like what kind of exercise is optimal. So what typically happens as we get old? We lose all of our characteristics of youth and athleticism, power and speed, springiness, the ability for our tendons and ligaments to be deforming and recoiling, energy, ultimate strength. coordination, balance, and ultimately VO2 max endurance. So what I'm looking at now, having been someone who performed at a high level physically, there's definitely a difference at 38 and 21 when it comes to what you can do and how quickly you recover. But how can you keep these variables on some degree of improvement or increase over time to the point where, let's say someone's 70 years old and they're as fit as they were at 60? There's a point to where maintenance is progressed. So for me, from an exercise perspective, zone 2 cardio, doing some degree of zone 5 short burst stuff, focusing on making sure that you have adequate range of motion and mobility, which is super important for men. Guys tighten up through the hips more than anything. So making sure that you're taking not only your muscles, but your ligaments, your connective tissue, your joint to passive ranges of motion that you have yet to experience and developing active strength to control those extreme ranges. It's what I see every old athlete who resists injury does really well. And the ability to keep your, VO2 max up via zone 2 and various other cardio training zones ultimately helps that delivery of oxygen to working tissues, the ability to upregulate total metabolic energy, because the muscle is technically our largest metabolically active organ. And the more of it we have, the more it's able to dispose of glucose in our bloodstreams, the more it's able to generate muscle protein synthesis. As we get older, getting old, being frail and weak is dangerous. That's, sarcopenia is a serious driver of mortality in people. So, in the longevity aspect of things, I know a lot of people are into caloric restriction and fasting and various things of that nature. I actually think that if you go too deep into that, you start to induce too many catabolic processes in the system because the body wants to move. The body needs to be stimulated and stressed because it also regulates how our nervous system controls our tissues.
And cortisol is an extremely catabolic hormone. It breaks down the tissue of a lot of the places you don't want to break down tissues, such as even the brain. And so if you're getting cortisol dysregulation from over fasting, as was, I guess, more prevalent a couple of years ago when it was all the craze, it seems to have died down a little bit, then you're going to set up your body to downregulate thyroid, and which slows down your metabolism, and it's a whole cascade of negative effects. And even if it does improve your lifespan, it won't necessarily improve your health span. If you're becoming sarcopenic and frail, not necessarily going to be a trade-off that most people pursuing longevity ultimately want to make.
You brought up something so brilliant that's worth mentioning. So many people feel so good when they're fasting because cortisol is euphoric. Adrenaline is euphoric. And they're like, oh man, my ketones are so high. I feel so focused. I'm like, no, that's a stress response actually. And the problem with that is not only is cortisol, all the things you mentioned, it shrinks the hippocampus. So things like short-term memory and long-term memory consolidation become compromised. Cortisol reduces the elastic properties of certain tissues. So their ability to deform and deal with physical stresses are downregulated. And I think it was put, cortisol is the hormone of aging. I think the reason people get fasting wrong is they try to be more productive when fasting. It's like, no, you're sending the wrong message. If you're fasting, you should chill. You want to recruit as much parasympathetic activity as possible so your system isn't needing that cortisol response to regulate blood sugar levels and start to break down muscle tissue. If we're talking about therapeutic fasting, it's a whole different conversation, but the biohackers, I'm only going to eat once a day, I'm going to be like at the top of my game all the time, it's not an optimal recipe for what they think they're chasing because it dysregulates hormone signaling, ultimate hormone production, as you said, downregulation of thyroid function, lowering of metabolism, predisposition to begin body fat. It all follows the trend, but it happens over months. It's not the one time.
Yeah. Well, let's go on to some of the effective things you found in the fitness realm for longevity or just general fitness that are beyond the just normal VO2 max and building strength and mobility. Anything that you found that really moves the needle?
One thing that I've realized is developing a more acute sense of body awareness with Exercises that, let's use classic bodybuilding as an example, right? So they're great for stimulating muscle hypertrophy, which is a wonderful thing. But there is the ability to develop strength within muscle without necessarily equalizing strength within connective tissue. So one thing that I found to be very beneficial is using things like basic calisthenics or getting into some flow exercises that not only recruit connective tissue and require stronger connective tissue in addition to stronger muscles, but they develop this body awareness of positional integrity and strength, but they also allow you to manipulate and move your body in a way that makes you more resilient and bulletproof, in my opinion. The other thing that I think they do is they teach you to be explosive without necessarily having that explosive load outside of you. So like a power clean or a power snatch for the average person or a box jump is a high risk exercise if they have not developed that as they go. But as you learn to do some of these basic movements where you're stable and supported and you start to increase the speed of your movement, I think that's a wonderful thing. Another wonderful exercise that most people don't do after the age of 30 is sprinting. I think the average person, if they build themselves into it, regains a lot of physical capability with including something like sprinting and calisthenics in, because the one secret, I don't know if it's a secret, but the one thing they bring back in is an element of fun. There's an element of creativity. There's an element of like youthfulness that on a subconscious level takes you back to something that is not just, oh, I got to go do my 3 sets of 12 of bench press and lat pull down. So I think those things are absolutely wonderful. I would say that simply being as active as you can, walking, and if you live in a climate that allows for it, which most do right now, walk barefoot. Get movement while being in touch with the earth. There's a compounding effect there. Because if we live most of our lives either with rubber soles covering our feet or we're inside with our feet never touching the ground, the earth has a pulse. It's got I think it's 9.83 hertz, called the Schumann resonance, and the earth is slightly negatively charged. It's electron rich. Our bodies mirror that because we are our own little microcosm walking the earth. So a lot of the benefits that come from exercising outside, being in touch with the earth, not only do they add to the physical development characteristics that allow us to age optimally and resist injury and degradation, but there's just a health effect by getting in touch with the earth, being outside, getting fresh air and getting sunlight that I think they don't add to exercise. It's like adding a multiplication to exercise. So that's one thing that society doesn't promote or suggest nowadays. And if people can find space for that in their exercise routine, it's so beneficial.
The other side of that is we've been conditioned that movement should be exercise and it should be expending more energy than we're receiving from it. And Paul Chek has a concept he calls working in, where it's the opposite. Instead of activating our sympathetic nervous system, we're activating our parasympathetic. And these are gentle restorative movements like Tai Chi and Qi Gong. And for someone who's already stressed and perhaps doing long bouts of fasting, parasympathetic dominant exercises can be much more restorative and energizing and beneficial to the body than just doing another intense sprinting and power cleans and full-on resistance program where they're also sprinting or running to the gym and trying to train VO2 max at the same time.
Well, do you not find it interesting that what you said comes back to the example of the yin and the yang, right? The balance. I can't escape it in my life no matter what I try to look at and disprove it being conserved by that concept. Like within the physical realm, that's a beautiful explanation because the sympathetically driven stuff hopefully gives rise to a nice parasympathetic response. But you also want a sympathetic response where you have the ability to slow everything down so you can put your foot on that gas pedal when required. Things like Qigong and Tai Chi make us better at the exercise, the externally focused things we do called exercises when we perform them because our bodies are more resilient and more ready to deal with the physical rigors of what that exercise provides, or I should say demands of us.
Well, Roland, we'll start to wind this one down because we've already been going for a while. But before we get to the final questions, I would love to know some of the biohacks that are popular today that you like or dislike.
There are things that I think should be contextually categorized. An example, everyone nowadays is jumping into a cold plunge. I think cold plunge has value, but if you take someone who is in a state of regulation that we assumed and discussed in the beginning, you can stress them to the point where you're furthering their disparity into a state of recovery. I've had athletes who, I had them do a chest strap heart rate variability assessment after a cold plunge, and they've swapped their nervous system regulation state to where they're more parasympathetic standing up and more sympathetic lying down. So that amount of stress under the wrong condition can be actually, I don't want to say detrimental, but highly stressful to the body. And when someone is trying to find the off switch, the reason that cold plunges are so exhilarating for people is because they induce that catecholamine response that people love and it feels good, but just because it feels good, you might not want to do it. Insert inappropriate joke here. Well, that's one I do like. And I think the other thing is true when it comes to, high dose infrared saunas and various other things. Just because someone does something and they get benefit, it doesn't mean you're automatically going to do the same or receive the same. I think it's very appropriate to contextualize where you are in life and what it is you're seeking this thing for to figure out if it's the right tool for you. I'd say one other thing that I don't dislike it, but I think it's important to communicate. A lot of people who like to self-quantify with tracking things, they'll compare their HRV with other people's HRV. Nick, who has a better thumbprint, me or you?
I think you do in this case.
Okay, well, fair enough. I would say it's a stupid question, but I appreciate you giving me the little validation there. But it's as valuable as asking that question, right? Each one is unique. So if my Oura Ring says 56 and your Oura Ring says 42, there's no comparing us, but the one with 56 feels better about their life. The one with 42 feels worse. So anything that's a biohack or a biotrack, understand there is a biochemical individuation that must be considered for all of the data, because comparing you against yourself is the only thing that really matters.
To make that last one even worse, I've noticed that when I'm really pushing it hard and I'm overtraining, under recovering, I usually am like sympathetically dominant. So I have a HRV below 100 milliseconds by most algorithms. But then if I'm like getting out of balance even further, I'll flip and become parasympathetically dominant. And my HRV, even though I'm not sleeping as much, I'm overtraining, under recovering, it'll jump up to like 120, 130, and it'll stay there until I get enough sleep and I tone it back a bit. And then it'll come back down into like a higher level, but still within my normal range. So even if you see a higher number without context, even with HRV, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing.
You see what the body tries to do, right? The body tries to let you know what it wants you to do in order to find your homeostasis again. So higher HRV in the context of being exhausted, that's because your body's trying to make you parasympathetic so you can heal and recover. And this is unfortunately what's not necessarily understood by a lot of people, because why would they want to go and figure these things out? If it's not their vocation, it's very much personal dedication that allow you to understand it. So I'm glad you said that. That's a very wise thing.
All right, Roland, if people want to connect with you, how do they get a hold of you?
Oh God, I dread being asked this question because I don't have anything. I don't have any social media. I currently don't have a website. I mean, if they want to reach out to you and you can get in touch with me for the moment, that's totally cool. I am in the process of getting things established. I've enjoyed kind of being able to hide from society for a while, only because it gave me a chance to learn all this stuff without the distraction or the necessity of having to maintain a platform. I think it's time that I started one, just because I would like to share what I've learned and the skills that I have been taught and developed with other people, so that if they want to use them and learn them to help other people, that's the ultimate goal.
Yeah. And once you have a website or something developed, any communication channels, I will put those in the show notes for this episode too.
Thank you very much.
And there's also usually a disparity between like the best people who are in their field on the front lines, trying to master their craft and hunt out new information. They're not able to also be the best marketer at the time. And if you try and do both, then you go down the middle and you don't do either of them very well.
No, I've learned that people pay you for your strengths, And if you can delegate your weaknesses or at least find assistance, which I'm in the process of doing because I'm not a social media marketing guy. You know, I'm technology and I don't get along because I've chosen that relationship. But if I can have someone there to support me through that, it allows me to do what I feel much more comfortable and skillful in doing.
All right, Roland, if there was a worldwide burning of the books and all knowledge was lost, but you get to save the works of 3 teachers, 3 books, 3 podcasts, 3 interviews, you name it, what would you choose and why?
That is a really interesting question. So I'd have to put the Kybalion in there for obvious reasons. We talked about it in depth. There's a book by Richard Bach called Illusions, Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah. It's a very short, easy read. I think it was written in the 80s. I've probably read that book 15 times because I feel like it's a fun handbook for navigating the world through philosophy and metaphor. There is a gentleman by the name of Ishak Bentov, and he was unfortunately killed in a plane crash, and I believe the either late 70s or early 80s. And he wrote a book called Stalking the Wild Pendulum. That book made bridging the gap between the spiritual and the physical realms more fun, enjoyable, and simplistic. And I think if anyone wants to start being able to understand the nature of where the atomic and the subatomic worlds collide, that's one of the best books I've ever written because it's written for someone who's not a scientist. I think he was actually ostracized and ridiculed, you know, for what it is he does. And there's a gentleman whose name I'll mention, Victor Schauberger. If anyone wants to figure out how a brilliant mind can escape the confines and the restrictions of academia and do more than any human with no formal education, watch his documentary.
I have one last question for you before we part ways today. What is one thing that your tribe does not know about you?
One thing my tribe does not know about me. I love that you asked me this question. That allows me to talk about something that I don't often do. Years ago, when I did my first ayahuasca experience, I had this shift in my reality where things started to open up and I was able to tap into things that I thought were absolute bullshit before. So this concept of psychic phenomenon became part of my normal life. So a lot of the work I do with people when I'm helping them through things is I do a lot of what I would call shamanic style work of taking them back in time, regression. I get downloads of things with people. I get little symbolisms of a lot of the people I work with in dreams. So, you know, I've always been this scientifically minded or this perceived scientific person to which I am. But most of my reality now is operated by feel. I've gotten out of the mind as much and I try to get more into the heart. I try to use more intuition than I do logic. And when you can get to the point, and Robert Edward Grant is someone I love who said this, when the heart thinks and the mind feels, you open up this Pandora's box of what you can perceive in terms of your own reality and the expansion of your own consciousness. And every human on the planet has the potential for it to happen. You know, I think it finds you at different times when your soul is ready, but my tribe doesn't really know that, you know, that's a world I spend a lot of time in, not only in working with people, but in my day-to-day existence. You know, you communicate with the universe in your relationship with it in universal language. So that would be kind of like my thing. My admittance is I'm a right-brained individual living in a left-brain perceived world of science and logic.
Oh, very cool. And so you were not living that way until your ayahuasca experiences.
I was denying my true nature because I thought I needed to be a different version of myself. And that version of myself was not encouraged and nurtured as a young child and as an adolescent. So I shut it off and I became ignorant to the innate style that I had. And I tried to force something that was more what I thought would bring me acceptance of reality, which is just acceptance of self. But since I've gone, you know, I'm old enough to the point where I don't give a shit anymore. I'm just going to be me as the expressed personality that I am. And that is something that is still fairly new to me in a way to communicate it to someone else.
Well, that's a good way to wrap this up, but we've covered a lot of ground together today. Are there any final thoughts that you want to leave listeners with?
know that where you are in your journey is perfectly okay for you. And it's a very cliche thing, but we don't see how things organize themselves until hindsight is available to us. So understand that, words are symbolic sounds with meanings we ascribe to them. So whatever challenges that you're having in your life, know that you signed up for it. You didn't necessarily consciously orchestrate it, but it is something that has been brought into your world for you to grow and expand and become a better version of yourself. That's the last thing I'd love to leave people with.
Perfect. Well, this has been a blast. I'm so glad that we were finally able to coordinate schedules and record today.
Likewise, Nick. Thank you for being persistent. Thank you for the time that you're taking for this interview. And thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. All right. Take care, Roland.
You too, buddy.
I hope that this has been helpful for you. If you enjoyed it, subscribe and hit the thumbs up. I love knowing who's in the 1% committed to reaching their full potential. Comment 1% below so that I know who you are. For all the resources and links, meet me on my website at mindbodypeak.com. I appreciate you and look forward to connecting with you. As a reminder, the information depicted in this video is for information purposes only. Please consult your primary healthcare professional before making any lifestyle changes.